Good morning, everybody. We're going to talk about three things in the first 2 hours of this 6-hour presentation. The first thing we're going to be talking about is constitutional basics. I will give you the framework that you may remember from law school, at least some of you who had me will remember. Never hurts to go over the basics again, so we'll go over constitutional basics. And then we'll switch gears to talk about aspects of police investigation that are not necessarily regulated by the Fourth or Fifth Amendment. We're going to focus on two specific parts, although I think, if I've timed this right, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. We can talk about other aspects of investigation. But the two that I'm going to go over are interviews and interrogations and photographic lineups. I have a really bad habit of pacing all over the place like a maniac when I'm talking. So if I lose track of where the edges of this stage are and fall off, I would appreciate prompt medical attention. So let's get started with constitutional basics. Obviously, in this context, we're talking about police investigations, and the constitutional components that apply are, shockingly, the Fourth and Fifth Amendment. This language should look vaguely familiar. I'm not going to read from slides because I don't like doing that. And I'm pretty sure everyone in here can read from the slides. If you can't see the slides, let someone nearby know and they can read it to you. So here's my suggestion for assessing Fourth Amendment issues. I would suggest that you establish a consistent framework, a method for working through Fourth Amendment issues, other than just saying, are there any Fourth Amendment violations? And here's the framework that I suggest. You can call this Stoughton's simplified map of Fourth Amendment analysis. The first question, of course, is look at every individual piece of evidence used against any individual defendant. Fourth Amendment rights, as you know, are defendant specific. So the fact that someone's Fourth Amendment rights were violated is a totally distinct question from whether a particular defendant's Fourth Amendment rights were violated. So first identify the particular defendant. I would suggest that that be your defendant, and then identify all of the pieces of evidence, and then figure out what the path of events that led to the discovery of that piece of evidence were. And within that path of events, the first question to ask is whether there was a search or seizure of this particular defendant. Well, obviously, we know that there are a bunch of complicated rules that we use to answer this question, whether someone had their reasonable expectation of privacy infringed upon under Katz, whether there was a physical trespassory physical contact, that's the word I'm trying to say, with an intent to gather information under Jones for searches, whether there's a meaningful interference of personal property for seizure of property, whether there's physical contact with the intent to restrain, or whether there's submission to a show of authority under a situation where an individual would not feel free to leave as a seizure of a person. Identify all of those things, all of those searches and seizures, either of a person or a thing. And if the answer is no, there aren't any, well, then you're kind of done with Fourth Amendment analysis. There were only consent encounters here, no searches or seizures. All right, well, now you can save your time and direct it elsewhere. But if the answer is yes, there was a search or a seizure, or multiple things that separately constitute searches or seizures, then I would suggest that you go on to the next question. The next question is it a constitutional search or seizure? Was it reasonable? And if the rules to answer the first question were complicated, the rules to answer this question are even more complicated. So complicated, I'm not even going to try to summarize them. You all know them and work with them, but this is a big important question. Of course, if the answer is yes, the search or seizure that you're analyzing, or the set of searches or seizures that you're analyzing are constitutional, no Fourth Amendment issues, carry on. But if the answer is no, then we go on to gasp yet another question. This is the fruit of the poisonous tree question, and I will tell you, I hate the phrase fruit of the poisonous tree. I know it's the legal doctrine that we all know about, but conceptually, I just have issues with it. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So I suggest thinking about fruit of the poisonous tree in terms of those familiar legal concepts of but-for and proximate causation. Was the evidence discovered as the but-for result, ooh, that was awkward grammatically, of an unconstitutional search or seizure? And if so, is the discovery of evidence the proximate result of that unconstitutional search or seizure? In other words, is this particular piece of evidence that you're looking at fruit of one of the potentially poisonous trees it's sort of a poisonous orchard, except for the fruit that's not poisonous and the trees that aren't, which is why I really don't like that phrase. I like the contaminated river analogy personally, but we won't go there. If the answer is no, that the unconstitutional search or seizure was not a but-for cause or approximate cause, for example, if there was an independent source or if there's inevitable discovery that comes into play, then again, no Fourth Amendment issues. But if the answer is yes, then there is yet another question to answer. Is exclusion appropriate? We all know that there is an exclusionary rule that purports under Mapp v. Ohio to apply to all evidence seized in violation of the Constitution, and in reality applies to a relatively small subset of evidence seized in violation of the Constitution. So this is the stage where you identify any exceptions to the exclusionary rule. If the answer is no, it's not subject to exclusion, no Fourth Amendment issues. If the answer is yes, then you have a pretty solid argument for the evidence not being admissible, at least in the case in chief, keeping in mind it can always be used for impeachment. So why is this helpful? Well, if you're taking a law school exam, it's helpful because it gives you a roadmap through the exam, but most of you aren't taking law school exams anymore. And I still think this framework is useful because it sets up your arguments. If you want to make an exclusionary rule argument, you have to follow a particular path. And I would submit to you that this framework does a decent job of charting that path for you. You have to argue that yes, it was a search or seizure, that no, it wasn't constitutional, for example. Applying a more consistent methodology than is sometimes briefed can be valuable. That's it. That's Fourth Amendment. We're going to do the same thing with Fifth Amendment, mostly because I'm just really proud of being able to put together a flow chart, and I'm showing off here. So here's the relevant language of the Fifth Amendment. I'm focusing on the self-incrimination clause, of course, comes up during police interrogations. And here's the relevant question. Again, we look at each piece of evidence used against a particular defendant, and we ask whether that piece of evidence is itself testimonial, or, and this is a part that sometimes gets missed, is it derived from testimony? And then we can engage in the same yes-no answers. If the answer is no, no Fifth Amendment issue. If the answer is yes, next question. If it is testimonial, was the defendant in custody? Custody being arrest or the functional equivalent of arrest. The answer is no, no Fifth Amendment issue. It doesn't apply. And of course, if the answer is yes, we have yet another question. Was the defendant interrogated, meaning expressly questioned, or subject to the functional equivalent of express questioning? That is, behaviors or actions on behalf of the officer that an officer, a reasonable officer in the situation, would know is likely to elicit an incriminating response. Again, if the answer is no, then no Fifth Amendment issues, and yes takes us to another question. Was there proper warning? Were all four parts of the Miranda warning provided? That is, was it sufficiently comprehensive? And was it provided in a language that was readily understood by the individual it was provided to? This might mean provided in a language, for example, that the defendant understands. Is it comprehensible? If the answer is no, well, now we have a Fifth Amendment issue, right? Now we can argue that there's a solid grounds for a Fifth Amendment issue. If the answer is yes, we're still not done because we have the waiver argument, implicit and explicit waiver. You are all familiar, I'm sure, with how easy it is to implicitly waive Miranda warnings. Just, speaking after being given Miranda warnings counts as an implicit waiver. So if the answer is no here, again, Fifth Amendment issue, no valid waiver. If the answer is yes, there is yet one more question, and that's unambiguous invocation. And I'm sure you all are more familiar than I am with what it takes to unambiguously invoke one of your Miranda rights, either silence or right to an attorney. If the answer to that one's no, then we're back to no Fifth Amendment issue. And if the answer is yes, then at least we have the potential for evidence to be likely excluded. Testimonial evidence excluded, derivative evidence probably not. And that's the Fifth Amendment framework. And that took about 10 minutes total. So I think we're doing okay, and we can spend more time on the interviews, interrogations, and photographic lineup stuff. It's just back out there. Before I do, brief pause. Any questions about that stuff? I don't think it ever hurts to go over the basics, which is why I did it. Also, flowcharts are awesome. All right. So now we're turning to investigations, and a significant amount of what police do in investigations, and even more a significant amount of how police do it in investigations, are not well regulated, or maybe even not regulated at all by law. There is no constitutional obligation, for example, for officers to do a good investigation. There is a state law, we have state common laws, you know, that require a reasonably diligent investigation into things. But what does a reasonably diligent investigation look like? I think that we can draw on a pretty broad area of law to say that what we're talking about is something that meets professional standards, a professional duty of care, if you will, in the investigative context or the policing context, as opposed to, say, I don't know, the medical or malpractice context. So what does a good investigation look like, or maybe not look like? I think we can divide investigations into two different types. There are investigations that are the type that I am talking about, which are at least putatively fact-finding investigations. They're supposed to be objective investigations. And then there are advocacy investigations. If you are doing an investigation to prove a particular point or to disprove a particular point, for example, if you send your investigator out to help generate exculpatory evidence, right? But what I am talking about is the police investigation. And again, at least putatively, that's supposed to be an objective fact-gathering investigation. The phrase, I'm sure you've all heard, is follow the facts wherever they lead, right? So that implies that failing to follow facts that might lead in a particular direction, or following facts that lead in a weird direction, may not actually be following professional standards. And one of the examples, let me pause. I don't have any bloody pictures to show you guys, and I feel like I'm denying you value there. And I'm not really going to tell you any war stories or anecdotes. Again, I'm denying you value. I apologize for that oversight. Had I known that that was where the bar was, I would have had bloody pictures and war stories. So I don't. The best I have is hypotheticals, because I'm a law professor, and as best as I can tell, we live in hypothetical worlds. So, investigations. The wrong way to do an objective investigation is to identify a hypothesis and then look for evidence that confirms the hypothesis, right? Let's play a game. I'm going to give you a series of numbers, and I'm going to tell you that the series of numbers has a particular pattern, and your job is to identify what that pattern is. And the way that you can identify what that pattern is by asking me to evaluate a series of numbers that you give me to see whether it fits the pattern that you've identified. Does that make sense, or is that complete freaking gobbledygook? Okay, good. Here's the pattern. Ready? 2, 4, 8. That has the pattern that I am looking for, 2, 4, 8. So what series of 3 numbers would you want to give me to test your hypothesis of what that pattern is? 10, 12, 16. Yes, that fits the pattern. What's your hypothesis as to what that pattern is? No. $16, $32, $64. Yes, that fits the pattern. What's the hypothesis? Nope. 1, 2, 4. That also fits the pattern. Well, that's what he just said. Copycat. Yes, also fits the pattern. What's the hypothesis? No. So what you're doing, yes, that also fits the pattern. I mean, that's true. That's not the connection either, though. So I want you to note what just happened with a number of examples here. Thank you, my beautiful assistants. We had hypotheses that were then stated affirmatively, right? Here is my hypothesis, and I'm going to see if he says, yes, this pattern holds. But when you're really investigating something, you want to take your hypothesis and then see if you can break it. So give me something that isn't within your hypothesis and see whether it still fits. For example, if you thought that the pattern was that numbers doubled every time, you might say 1, 2, 3, because unless math has changed again recently, those numbers don't double every time. If I say, yes, that still fits the pattern, then you go, well, shit, my hypothesis was no good. And you need to switch hypotheses. Does that make sense? A good objective investigation does something very similar. Instead of developing a theory of the case the way you do as an advocate, and the way that you are supposed to do as an advocate, a good investigation starts with we don't know what the fuck's going on. Let's figure it out by trying to break various hypotheses. Does that make sense? Is that clear enough? Okay. So the first question perhaps to ask when you're reviewing a police investigation is, was it trying to confirm a theory or was it testing a variety of different theories? If it was trying to confirm a particular theory, and I'm sure you all have examples of exactly what I'm talking about, this is the theory that they bought into at the very get-go, then there are a series of psychological phenomena that make it very difficult for an investigator who is locked into a theory to see beyond the theory. Maybe the most important of these is called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to view evidence in a way that confirms our pre-existing theory and to discount evidence that cuts against our pre-existing theory. There are a bunch of others that we're not going to get into because I do want to spend most of our time on these particular examples, but that's sort of meta comment on police investigations or any objective or putatively objective investigation. Now, of course, at a particular point, a police investigation stops being a objective fact gathering, figure out what all the facts are and tell the story, and starts being a identify a particular person for purposes of supporting criminal prosecution. It converts at some point, where exactly depends on every investigation, it converts at some point from an objective investigation to an advocacy investigation. And one of those things happens at interviews and interrogations. One of the most important aspects of interviews and interrogations is figuring out whether everyone was spoken to who needed to be spoken to. In my effort to avoid reading from the slide, I just butchered the English language, and I hope you all appreciate that and can defend me in my later murder trial. That was awfully said. Was everyone who needed to be interviewed or investigated actually, interviewed or interrogated, actually interviewed or interrogated? Is this the type of case that needed a neighborhood canvass? Were all of the relevant officers providing statements or supplemental reports? After all, officers can also be potential witnesses, and although they may not be interviewed in a particular case, a report rather counts as their statement. Were there on-scene individuals witnesses who were ignored for one reason or another? Were all of the relevant people actually spoken to? Were witnesses properly separated? This is a pretty big deal. It relates to contamination errors, which we'll talk about in a little bit. This is part of Investigations 101. Was everyone separated? I can't read my own screen from here. Were the right questions asked? What questions were the right questions really depends on the type of case and the particular person being interviewed. But the right questions might be of an eyewitness: where were you standing? How far away? Were there any obstacles? How dark or light was it? Did you have a clear line of sight to this thing that you said you saw, right? In the absence of those questions, what we have are assumptions. And we all know that assumptions make asses out of you. I'm waiting for someone to say "and me" so I can nod knowingly. No one did. Well done. You've passed my little test. Now let's get technical a little bit. In interviews and interrogations, at some point the interview switches to the interrogation. And police lingo, generally what that means is the fact gathering turns into confession seeking. And the first technical issue to be aware of is something called a misclassification error. Misclassification errors are really about distinguishing honesty from deception. Is this person telling the truth or not? How do you identify whether someone is telling the truth or not? Well, you look at behavioral indicators, right? You look at what someone is doing. You look at how they're speaking. You look at whether they're fidgeting. I regret to inform you that behavioral indicators are bullshit when it comes to detecting deception. They are all but useless. In fact, in reputable psychological journals, there was a fascinating study, which I will get to in just a second. This is a chart from that study that identified or coded a bunch of different behavioral indicators. Is that too small to see? Can you guys read that at all? No? All right. Well, I will read a couple of them. Hesitations or use of speech fillers like and I like that we had 5 different speech fillers as examples in the chart. That makes me happy. Oops, I'm sorry. I gave the Vulcan wave to the camera and it stopped following me. This is the creepiest little fucking thing I've ever seen, by the way. It's so cool and really creepy. Hi. I had no hard feelings. A high-pitched voice, speech errors, latency period, that is a period of silence between a question being asked, gaze aversion, someone smiling or fidgeting or facial fidgeting, as it is called, touching or rubbing the face, for example. All of these are common perceptions or commonly offered as indicators of dishonesty. And what the study did, taking an actual murder, a confirmed murder, boy, I keep seeing all the, who has the hoodie that says allegedly on it? It's an awesome hoodie. Yeah, there you go. It's awesome hoodie. I love it. But this guy was actually, like, he did it, right? Good, solid evidence. And there was a confession, an interview, an interrogation, a confession, and they used it to examine all of these different factors. And they found that almost none of them are statistically significantly correlated. That is, none of them reliably indicate deception. The two that have a statistically significant correlation, fidgeting, what's called undifferentiated fidgeting, and let me see if I can move that so I can identify the other one. And a high-pitched voice. What? Murder? Me? Those are statistically significant. They are correlated with deception, but the statistical significance is so low that they are basically unreliable. In other words, none of the factors, none of the behavioral indicators that we think, and that is widely trained in policing, as establishing deception actually establish deception. And worse, according to this study, people who have stereotypical views of what type of behavioral indicators are indicative of deception are actually worse at identifying deception. The more confident you are in identifying deception, the worse you are at identifying deception. Fascinating, I think. Additionally, when people are trying to tell the truth, that is, when they are motivated to tell the truth, they actually appear more deceptive. And fascinatingly, I think, in a journal of personality and social psychology research, they found that deceivers are actually subjectively nervous. They are more nervous than truth tellers, but they are also better at hiding nervousness, which means that behavioral indicators of nervousness really doesn't mean a whole lot because we're good at hiding it as people. All of which suggests that behavioral indicators of dishonesty are, to use the technical phrase again, bullshit. I was not told what PG rating this conference was, but given the bloody pictures, profanity is the best I got. So what is useful? Well, the best we have is something called cognitive interviewing. Cognitive interviewing is effective at distinguishing honesty from dishonesty, but it's imperfect. It's not totally reliable. It's just more reliable than behavioral interviewers. Cognitive interviewing might be, for example, focusing on details. There is a statistically significant and meaningful correlation between the number of details that someone can provide and honesty. Because they don't have to make up details, they tend to give more consistent, detailed statements, right? And in a really interesting bit of research, the same group that did the study from which that first graph came, the chart, also found that having someone sketch out information about a scene has a significant correlation between truth-telling. The people who are truth-tellers are able to provide, again, more detail, this time visually, not just audibly. So how might misclassification errors come up? Well, remember that thing about confirmation bias? If my theory as an investigator is this person did it, and I'm now interrogating them, I'm not trying to gather information anymore, I'm now trying to establish a confession from them, then there's this whole range of behaviors that are actually potentially consistent with honesty that I'm going to interpret as dishonesty. And I'm sure you've seen reports and testimony where behavioral indicators are provided as an explanation for why an officer believes someone was dishonest, and not in the report why an officer continues to interrogate or push in a particular way. These are all psychologically referred to as misclassification errors. That make sense? All right. Your code word today is saluda, and the number is 2.2. That's 2.2 and saluda. Write down the number and the word. Which seems vaguely ominous, actually, or something that someone might say at a cult meeting. Write down the number and the word. Saluda. Okay, so beyond misclassification errors, there's another type of error that you should be attuned to when looking at interviews and interrogations, and that's a coercion error. This is the one that you may be most familiar with, so we'll go through it with alacrity. Coercion errors, whoo, big block of text. You can probably make your way through that. Essentially, there are two different types of coercion errors, or at least psychologists can distinguish between two different types of coercion errors. There's individual coercion, that is one particular thing that is in and of itself so coercive that it leads someone to provide incorrect information. Now that might be a confession, yes, I did it, or it might be a false implication of someone else. So don't just think about false confessions, also think about incorrect or false statements or accusations that implicate someone else. Those individually coercive things, while not always easy to identify, are the ones that get the most receptivity in the courts. The other type of coercion error is the trickier one, and that's recognized in psychology as a collection of pressures that, in the aggregate, prompt someone to provide fake information, either a false confession or false accusation. If you've done any looking or reading into false confessions of exonerated defendants, these are not folks who there is some question on the table. These are folks who have been exonerated by DNA or other scientifically validated evidence. A startlingly high percentage of them involve either false confessions from the defendant or bad information provided by someone else. So this is an important issue. What do these coercion errors look like? Here's the citation if you're interested in reading where that quote came from. This might look like assertions of guilt. We know you did it. At this point, I'm just trying to figure out why. Or it looks like a reduced moral culpability. You didn't kill the guy because you're a bloodthirsty murderer, right? You killed the guy because he had done you wrong and you have to represent. It's not as bad that way. Or pleas to conscience. Or, look, man, I'm just trying to get your side of the story. Help me help you. Maybe it'll help. There'll be other causative consequences. You and your family can move on. Or one of my favorites, you can save the expense of a lawyer. Or negative consequences. You don't cooperate, that's going in the report too. In fact, you might even be at risk. We could protect you if you helped us, but not if you don't. And you're lying. Assertions of dishonesty. We know you're lying right now. Nothing you say except the truth is going to help you get out of this little interrogation room. Isn't it possible, this is suggestions of possibility, obviously, isn't it possible that you did actually do this? Or that person A, right? Isn't it possible that they did this? I mean, you said you saw them immediately before, but isn't it possible that on the way home they swung by this person's house and stabbed them 47 times? I really feel bad about not having bloody pictures, so I'm just going to try and reference bloody things. You know this. Where do assertions of knowledge come in? Well, when someone says, I don't know, I wasn't there, I don't remember that, I'm not sure, I don't know. Oh, you know. It's just a matter of you remembering. So let me help you remember the details. I will pause for your gasps of astonishment when I say that that is not how human memory works. Contradictory evidence, either real contradictory evidence, which can be tremendously valuable, or fake contradictory evidence. When I was investigating, I wish this was a joke, but it was not. It is not. I would take like a 5-inch binder into an interrogation room that was not part of the case that I was investigating. It was some case that I had closed 2 years ago. And if they said something that I didn't like, flip that bad boy open. Well, the obvious implication there is evidence that contradicts what you just said, right? Asserting that the investigator is being honest and fair. I've been honest with you, you be honest with me. It's kind of a dick move after the 5-inch binder from a totally different investigation, but welcome to the game. And finally, look, we have this conclusion, right? We have this information already. We've determined that this is what happened, circling all the way back sort of to assertions of guilt, but this is what the investigation has concluded. This is what the forensics show. This is what the science shows. Now, here's the really tricky part. You cannot look for these and say, aha, I see some of these or all of these, and this makes the information invalid, right? This makes the information no good. I have no idea. Some number of people who are presented with each and every one of these coercion errors are confessing because, and I know this is going to shake you to your core, they're actually guilty, right? Sometimes they're providing information about their guilt because they feel coerced, psychologically, if not legally. Sometimes they're providing information because they don't feel coerced, they just want it, whatever, who cares, right? There is no way for anyone, and I would challenge you to be very skeptical of anyone who suggested otherwise, there's no way to look at an investigation and say, this proves that the information provided was false. The best we can do is say, these tactics are consistent with coercion errors. They can contribute to and are consistent with bad information. Although without some independent, extrinsic source of information, like, I don't know, DNA evidence is the semi-obvious example, you can't rule in or out honesty. You can just say this is consistent with errors. Does that make sense? Sort of disappointing, I know. And it gets worse, because we're talking about police investigations, so why wouldn't it get worse? It gets even worse when we're talking about vulnerable individuals, juveniles, people with mental health challenges, but not just the obvious. Individuals who have low self-esteem, a class that is not generally protected separately under law, or individuals who have some, I'll use the phrase that's in the study here, low assertiveness. I'm sure you can think of people in your professional or personal lives who are just not particularly assertive. Mom, talking about you, my mother would confess to almost anything. She might have done it, but she would definitely confess to it, right? Just not a very assertive person. So there are personality traits, not just the obvious ones of age and mental infirmity. There are personality traits that can increase someone's susceptibility to coercion errors, both individual and aggregate coercion errors. There's that citation as well. I think we're good on timing. All right, so misclassification errors, coercion errors, and finally, contamination errors. Contamination error, I don't have a zoom in. I know that's very disappointing. Contamination errors are essentially when someone other than the individual who is being interviewed or interrogated introduces information that the person being interviewed or interrogated then parrots or echoes. This is maybe the clearest thing that you can identify watching videos of interviews or interrogations or reading transcripts of interviews and interrogations. And the way to do so is to look for nuggets of information. He was wearing a green shirt or whatever, and figure out who said that first. And not just that, but even if the person being interviewed in an interrogation said it first, backtrack and see why they said it. Was it a direct answer to a direct question? What was the person wearing a green shirt? Or is it actually the result of a series of targeted pressure questions? What was he wearing? I think blue overalls. Are you sure that's what he was wearing? Maybe a t-shirt? Okay, what color was the t-shirt? A dark color? Like what kind of dark color? Closer to green or closer to black? Right? Oh, green. Well, great. The defendant said the word green shirt first, but in that hypothetical example, it's a result of a contamination error. Contamination errors are also why you want witnesses, including officers, when the situation requires it, to be interviewed separately, because people play off of each other. Back to psychology for a second, there's a concept called conformity. There is informational conformity and normative conformity. Informational conformity is when you take your cues about how to behave or what information to provide from the people around you. How many of you have ever had a conversation with one of your parental units where there has been some implicit disapproval of something on either of your parts? So the other person maybe shifts the way they're presenting just a little bit. That's informational conformity. Normative conformity is a little different. It's a little more fun. Normative conformity is we do things, so I'm going to die. How's the conference's liability insurance, by the way? Normative conformity is we generally do things, we behave in the way that we think people around us expect us to behave. So it would be nuts, for example, for someone giving a talk to stand up on a table on the podium, risking life and limb in what can only be described as an incredibly masculine disregard of death and dismemberment. This would be nutty, right? And I would never do this because you would all think that I'm very weird and I don't want to be thought weird. That's normative conformity. In the context of interviews and interrogations, we can get contamination errors from both informational conformity and normative conformity. This is the pressure question that is being asked. Are you sure that's the right answer? Well, that can establish both informational and normative conformity that can make someone, especially someone vulnerable to coercion errors, say, oh no, that wasn't right. Let me give you this other information. So 3 big errors to pay attention to: misclassification errors, coercion errors, and contamination errors. That's it for interviews and interrogations. Let us push on to photographic lineups. All right, so photographic lineups. We're all familiar with the concept of photographic lineups. Here are another series of check marks for you. Was the photographic lineup properly double-blinded? As it turns out, blinding, that is the scientific method, essentially, or part of the scientific method, is really important when we're providing lineups, because even if an officer does not mean to provide any cues, there are a number of unconscious cues that someone can unconsciously pick up on that can influence their decision. So best practices here for photographic lineups to be double-blinded. What does that mean? It means that the officer who is administering the lineup does not know which picture represents the defendant. They have no idea, right? Okay, and then they administer the lineup. That's enough on double blinding. Were the pictures appropriate? This is really the only area that constitutional law really regulates. Are the pictures similar enough and not too dissimilar, but not too identical to the particular defendant? This is a matter of case law. I'm not going to talk about it. I can talk about it in the Q&A, but I want to get to the fun, what I think is the fun stuff. And that's where the appropriate instructions given. There's some really interesting, again, back to psychology. I'm not a psychologist. I read enough to throw around psychological concepts at conferences and really upset my wife with them. But one of the areas of psychology that comes from photographic lineups is that instructions are actually pretty important. And the important instructions include, can you read that on that background? That was a bad choice on my part. Informing the individual who's doing the lineup that the subject may or may not be depicted. They might not even be there. So don't feel any obligation to identify someone. Stating explicitly that the investigator, whoever is administering the lineup, does not know who the perpetrator is or which picture depicts them. Photographs are presented individually and in random order. We'll talk more about that in just a second. That the individual should take as much time as they need. There's no hurry here. And finally, even if you identify someone, you're going to see all of them, right? So don't feel the obligation to identify anyone. And you can stop. You can identify someone at any point, but I'm going to continue to show all of these pictures to you. Those are the appropriate instructions. But you should be on the lookout for inappropriate instructions. These are not uncommon. Figure out who looks most like the suspect. Has anyone seen an instruction like this before? No one? Wow, there goes my analogy. Who looks most like the suspect? This is actually entirely wrong, because what you want the individual who's undergoing the lineup to do is compare their mental image of one person, say the suspect, to each individual picture that they're looking at. And when you tell them, well, who looks most like the person, you're not asking them for a one-for-one comparison. Is this or is this not the person? You're just saying, who has the most shared features? That's bad. One of these people is the suspect. Like, they're in there somewhere, pick them out. Take another look at this one, or take another look at all of them for that matter, right? But especially take another look at this one. And whether the answer is yes, that is, or no, that is not the person, are you sure? This is a bad question because of all of the same reasons that we talked about with contamination and conformity. So keep an eye on appropriate instructions and inappropriate instructions, and pay attention to whether the lineup was sequential, which is good, or simultaneous, which is the practice for many, many years and is actually bad. A sequential lineup is one person or one picture at a time. First look at this one, then we take it away. Then you get number two, then we take it away, right? Simultaneous lineup is the photo array. Here are 6 or 8 photos all on a single page. The problem with the 6 or 8 photo array, or however many, is the tendency to pick distinguishing features that look most like the individual rather than compare each picture against the witness's mental image of the individual. There are ways for a single, we can get into this if you'd like in the Q&A, there are ways for a single investigator who isn't blinded to blind themselves, which is not nearly as brutal as it sounds like. There's a folder method that can be used. So for example, a very small agency that can't just pick another investigator who has no involvement with the case. The investigator can use a system of folders that are randomized as a way to double blind. So there are all kinds of measures that are in place. And for reference here, I would suggest looking at Virginia's rules, because Virginia, their criminal whatever committee, I'm sorry, I forget the name, requires these procedures now as a matter of regulation. And they're pretty well established and evidence-based. And finally, how confident is the witness? This is an important question, and it is very different than the "are you sure" question. The confidence question is relevant because we know that someone's self-assessed confidence changes from the time of the identification to the time of trial. I'm sure you have been in trial and heard a witness say, I am 100% sure that that person that I just identified in the courtroom is the person that I saw committed the crime, right? There are lots of reasons for that. One of those reasons is they might actually just be sure, right? Maybe that is in fact the right person. But one of the reasons for that is the trappings of the trial rather suggest that that dude sitting in the defendant's table is the right dude. And now there is, again, informational conformity for someone to say, well, if the state thinks that that's the right guy, I am right to think that that's the right guy. So one of the important questions that unfortunately is not asked nearly enough is, at the time of identification, how confident are you in your selection? 60%, 70%, 80%, 100%, whatever. That's an important question that that you should pay attention to, or suggest if you don't see it. Okay, by my count, I have 13 minutes, 12 minutes, it just changed, for Q&A. So that's, I think I could have probably pulled in one more aspect of investigation, but that's all right. So I will pause for your 12-minute standing ovation or Q&A at your option. Yes. Yeah, so the question is, what about those situations where you don't have a photographic lineup or pre-existing witness identification and the state is offering an on-the-stand identification? How do you address that? Think about all of the physical and, well, psychological factors that go into that. Physical factors are maybe the easiest. There is a whole series of questions that if the state does not elicit, you should, about how far someone is, the lighting conditions and the like. If this is something that you anticipate happening, there are ways to set this up. For example, I am of the opinion that every office, PD's office and solicitor's office investigator should have a light meter so they can go out to a scene and measure ambient light at a particular time of day. Turns out that people's memory of what they saw, man, had I known you were going to ask that question, I have a whole series of slides that I could have used but didn't prepare. Our eyes are not particularly good at seeing, which seems like a really weird thing to say. The reason that they're not particularly good at seeing is because the part of your vision that you have sharp focus on, which is called foveal vision, is only about 4 to 6 degrees. If you hold your thumb out at arm's length and you have roughly normally sized arms, you can focus on approximately the area of your thumbnail. So one of the questions that you might ask is, where were you looking, right? Did you see someone? Did you look at their face? How in what type of conditions? The reason, there's so much more. All right, I'm going to try and breeze through some of this. I apologize for skimming some of it. Peripheral vision goes out to about 180 degrees or even a little more than 180 degrees, which is why I'm holding my hands out like an idiot and doing jazz hands, right? It's great at detecting motion. You're actually colorblind out at the edges of your vision. You think you aren't. You think you can see color there because your brain fills in the color, but you're actually colorblind. So if someone says, for example, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, not infrequent police statement, one, we can't actually identify what that movement is with detail. We're good at picking up movement, not good at defining what that movement is. And two, certain characteristics like color are just not actually plausible there, right? It's not true, despite how firmly we might believe it. Okay, the psychological components. I don't know that there is a good way to cross a witness on the psychology without getting a psychology expert up there. I think I would, any advice I provide is probably going to be very familiar, like look for inconsistencies. How closely does the description provided at the time, for example, match the actual defendant? Um, uh, Sometimes small things matter, like do you wear contacts or glasses, right? How good is your vision? Stuff that sometimes gets overlooked. I don't have a great answer for you other than do a good investigation. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, about which personality? Compliant personality. Okay, using, okay, all right. Yeah, okay, so the question is if you want to argue that someone provided a false confession and you want to use evidence of compliance or low assertiveness, right, compliant personality, and you get shut down, so you can't use an expert, I assume, to establish this person is compliant. How do you get that information out? Um, are you putting the defendant on the stand? Yeah, well, in some ways, that would make my life so much easier in answering this question because there are a series of questions you can ask them, potentially even using some of what the psychologists look at to determine low assertiveness or high compliance. But if not, um, can you get fact witnesses as to that person's compliance personality? Or are you just ruled out of expert testimony? Yeah. 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 So the answer, I think that's right. I think that might be the only path there. If you don't want to put the individual on the stand to ask a series of questions related to compliance or assertiveness, you can ask others with firsthand information about them a series of questions. What I would suggest doing is browsing the psychology literature to figure out what the series of questions are and then adapt them appropriately for your direct. So you're saying, sometimes even in dumbed down jury appropriate language, right? Um, how often when you go out to eat with this person ever? Do you socialize? How often do they pick the restaurant and how often do you do? Oh, they never do. They never do, right? It's always wherever you want, honey. Thanks, mom. Oh my God, my mother is haunting this whole talk. So I think that's what I would suggest is using others who can demonstrate this person just goes along with whatever they are provided, and focusing on going along and challenge, right? Are they conflict averse? When they are challenged with something, do they back down? How long have they done that? How long is that a defining characteristic of their personality? And then you can use that to say, look, they're challenged in this interrogation. When they provide information, I didn't do this, and they're told, yeah, you did. Okay, fine, I guess I did. Does that help? All right. What else? Okay, Mas. I'm so glad that I'm not between you guys and lunch, or worse, between you guys and beach day. That would be an awful position for me to be in personally. But I'm not, so suck it up. All right, we have 5 more minutes on my clock. Yes. Yeah. So the question is with drug interdiction and behavioral indicators of nervousness on the street, especially with regard to like Terry stop criteria, reasonable suspicion, or potentially probable cause for things like vehicle searches. Is it a good indicator of deception? Psychology says it's not a good indicator of deception. good luck convincing a court to overrule the Supreme Court, which says, of course we use nervousness, right? And we use factors as, we use someone's nervous behavior, nervous and evasive even in Illinois v. Wardlow, nervous and evasive behavior to assess whether officers had reasonable suspicion. But one thing to focus on is double counting or quadruple counting of nervousness, right? And there is some good case law. I think it's State v. Counts. Somebody help me if I'm wrong. I think it's State v. Counts in South Carolina, where the Supreme Court was rather skeptical of the number of separate factors that an officer used to identify nervousness. This person was sweating and fidgeting and wouldn't meet my eyes, and they were stammering. And what the court basically said is, that's all just nervousness. So yes, nervousness is a relevant factor for the determination of reasonable suspicion, but you only get to count it once as nervousness. Everything that you're identifying is simply a physical indicator of nervousness. So this isn't 4 or 5 different factors, this is one factor. That language is potentially valuable. The other aspect of nervousness, I think, would be to identify one, we might refer to this as a misclassification error, right? Is nervousness indicative of criminal behavior, or is nervousness indicative of someone being stopped by the police, a 16-year-old being stopped by the police for the first time while out at 11 o'clock at night or something like that? And culture and the effect of culture on misidentification, especially in multicultural communities. Columbia is a good example of that around the university. Different cultures have different behavioral norms, and what we read, or what an officer's background might read as deception, someone wouldn't meet my eyes, might actually have nothing to do with nervousness and might be, that's respectful, for example. So I would at least explore that possibility. 1, is nervousness actually nervousness? 2, if there is nervousness, is it the factor of nervousness that we should be using, or is it 17 factors, all of which are just related to nervousness? And 3, if it is nervousness, and it is however many factors there is nervousness, is there some argument about, well, yeah, obviously there's nervousness in this situation. Anyone would be, the reasonable person would be. That last point I will expand on ever so slightly. Indicators of suspicion that are totally normal in the context, in the circumstance, aren't suspicious anymore, right? Someone who's wearing a long coat in July might stick out as suspicious. Someone who's wearing a coat in 40-degree weather, especially here in South Carolina, where that's Arctic level cold, right? That's not suspicious anymore. You can't use that to rule in someone as suspicious. I would say the same thing with nervous behaviors. At least it's worth making the argument. These are behaviors that are not suspicious under the circumstances because they're entirely predictable and normal. And if it's entirely predictable and normal, it doesn't stand out anymore. Am I at 0? I am at 0. I got the thumbs up, not the peace sign. So thank you, everyone, for your time and attention. That's me.